The drizzle that draped the Wessex Downs on the evening of 14th October resembled nothing so much as the half-hearted tears of a faintly remorseful ghost, persistent, clammy, and altogether inconvenient to decent tweed. Lord Peter Wimsey, stepping from the battered Daimler that had conveyed him from London in a fit of cheerful imprudence, tilted his trilby against the wet and contemplated the modest timbered facade of Candlewick Farm. "Capital," he murmured, flicking a bead of water from his cuff. "A house of moderate antiquity, dubious comfort, and, unless my nose deceives me, excellent applewood smoke. One is almost persuaded Thanatos has paid a call." "Thanatos, my lord?" inquired Bunter, who had emerged from the car with an umbrella opened at military right angles. "Merely a classical commonplace, Bunter," said Wimsey, accepting the umbrella but ignoring its protection. "I seldom journey into the shires without finding death has anticipated me." He sniffed again with pleased curiosity. "Though I grant you, on this occasion death has chosen an unexpectedly pastoral parlour." Indeed, Candlewick Farm, low-beamed, thatch-roofed, and skirting a wind-worried orchard, hardly advertised itself as a seat of melodrama. It belonged to Miss Agatha Pym, a stout maiden gentlewoman who produced respectable cider, respectable eggs, and highly disreputable gossip. Wimsey's arrival owed less to gastronomy than to a letter dispatched in evident agitation. "Lord Peter, if ever you concerned yourself with oddities, pray come at once. My sister's guest-room key turned up in a milk pail of all places, and there is a stranger wandering the lanes at unholy hours. The farm hand will swear on St. Chad's relics he heard singing in Latin from the hen-coop at 3:45. No one is murdered, yet, but I dislike omens." Wimsey, who enjoyed nothing so much as a polite invitation to impending nonsense, had answered with alacrity. Thus, umbrella, drizzle, and a faint suspicion of applewood smoke. Before he might apply knuckle to knocker, however, the front door burst open. Out surged Miss Pym herself, shawl askew and cheeks like startled tomatoes. Behind her floated the peaked scent of lamp oil and wet straw. "My lord!" she cried, seizing his hands with matronly desperation. "Thank heaven! I can't think how you contrive such speed. There's been, well, that is, someone has done a dreadful thing in the granary." "A dreadful thing?" Wimsey echoed pleasantly. "In a granary? One hopes it was not an affront to the barley." Miss Pym gazed at him in horrified earnestness. "Alas, Lord Peter, affront scarcely covers it. Poor Mr. Mallet, my tenant on the south field, was found an hour ago lying upon the oat sacks, throat cut from ear to ear, and clutching a small black-letter Bible. The constable from Witheridge says it is suicide, but I have never known a man who could abide Scripture to make such a neat business of self-murder." Wimsey's eyes, grey and light as washed flint, widened a fractional degree, a movement Bunter alone would have noticed. "Suicide is notoriously untidy, Miss Pym. Did the constable adduce any theory regarding the convenient presence of a Bible?" "Saints preserve us, no. But he was gratified, I think, that the deceased left the thing behind as proof of remorse. I am not gratified. The latch was barred on the inside, yet the Bible is one of mine, kept in the parlour bookcase. It could not have walked there unaided, and Mr. Mallet was no scholar." Wimsey rocked on his heels, letting Drizzle stipple his monocle. "Bunter, attend me inside. Miss Pym, pray accept my condolences. We shall require tea, the darkest possible, and, if convenient, a fire large enough to melt the 10 Commandments." Within the low parlour, shadows licked the wainscot like sooty tongues. A grandfather clock tock-tocked with rustic self-confidence. The thing declared 6:30, though Wimsey's watch insisted the hour lacked 5 minutes. He produced a notebook and jotted "clock fast" with apparent irrelevance. "Tell me," he said, settling into a capacious armchair whose horsehair stuffing protested his arrival, "when last was Mr. Mallet seen alive by creditable eyes?" Miss Pym clasped her teacup with plump-knuckled fingers. Mrs. Tarleton, she keeps house. Served him supper at 7 yesterday, cold beef and mustard. He said he would read a little and then bed down in the granary, as he often does at harvest time. Nothing amiss. At dawn, the dairyman found the door still barred. He forced it after hearing no response. Then, well, you can imagine. A barred interior door, a Bible misplaced, and a throat cut in surgical fashion. Whimsy mused. Bunter, does that declare suicide to your photographic eye? No, my lord, said Bunter, polishing a silver teaspoon to mirror brightness. I have observed many departures by the self-chosen route. The majority are less deliberate with weapon care. Just so. Whimsy leaned forward, voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. Miss Pym, I assume the constable permits us a glance at the scene before he bundles Mr. Mallet off to Witheridge. He told me he would return with the doctor after supper, she answered. There is time. Excellent. Let us stroll granary wards before bureaucracy adds its obese footprint. He rose, pausing to study the damp imprint of his shoes upon the flagstones. Curious, the draught from beneath that door is warmer than the room itself. Has anyone tampered with your kitchen stove? Not that I know of, said Miss Pym, bewildered. Forgive me, a pedantry. Bunter, you observed the same? I did, my lord. With that cryptic exchange, Whimsy fetched his hat, and with the languid air of one departing the theatre for a light supper, invited Miss Pym to lead on. As they stepped back into the mizzle, now thickening to something between fog and accusation, Whimsy wagged a finger at the sagging signboard over the porch. Candlewick Farm, he read aloud, established 1732. How quintessentially bucolic. One only wonders, he added, almost to himself, whether the candles burn at both ends, and whose fingers are apt to be singed. The rain answered with soft insistence, and the orchard beyond the farmyard rustled like gossiping skirts. Somewhere, unseen, a nightjar uttered a single croak of protest, as though even the owls considered it unseasonable to be abroad. Thus, with umbrella, notebook, and an unspoken suspicion that nothing in Candlewick Farm's placid history would survive the coming interrogation, Lord Peter Whimsy went forth to view a corpse and, though no one yet guessed it, to unravel a little domestic apocalypse. The farmyard lay hushed beneath its wet mantle, save for the slow drip of rainwater from rust-flecked guttering and the soft, anxious shuffle of Miss Pym's rubber galoshes. Beyond the cider press shed sat the granary, a squat brick and timber cube raised on staddle stones like an ungainly altar. A lantern nailed to the lintel threw a sickly halo that danced on the puddles, and for an instant Whimsy's reflection, slender, monocled, sardonic, winked back at him from the water's skin before rippling out of shape. A single constable's seal, merely a loop of blue ribbon and a dab of red wax, hung forlornly across the door. Bunter peeled it away with the discretion of a valet removing dandruff from a lapel, and Whimsy raised the oak bar. It slid back with a sigh that sounded almost relieved. Miss Pym crossed herself, then blushed at the impropriety. Inside, the air struck the visitors as peculiarly scented, part grain dust, part lamp oil, and, faint but insistent, the metallic tang of blood already cooling. A hurricane lantern on a hook threw bars of jaundiced light across stacked oat sacks and glimmered on the iron teeth of a reaper lodged in the corner. On the floor lay William Mallet, body propped half upright against the sacks as though seated for an unwilling portrait. The wound at his throat was dark and smooth-edged. The clasped Bible rested open on his lap, pages blotched like brown lace. Whimsy crouched. Observe, Bunter, neat slice, scarcely a ragged fibre, a razor rather than a farm knife, wouldn't you say? Bunter's camera clicked once, twice, the flash powder hissing white. Indeed, my lord, and no spatters on the boards. Suggests the body was arranged before exsanguination ceased. Yes, the killer, if such, works tidily, almost reverently. Whimsy's fingers brushed a faint smear of something pale on the victim's cuff. He sniffed, frowned. Saltpeter? No. Potash soap. Miss Pym, does Mr. Mallet favor the fragranced bars you set by for dairy? Use. He uses whatever's to hand, Lord Peter, but I keep the lavender potash for washing the cider press. It cuts grease. Capital. Whimsy turned the Bible a fraction without disturbing the victim's grip. The ribbon marker lay at Isaiah, chapter 34. One verse leapt out. For my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Behold, it shall come down upon Idumea. He noted the pagination, replaced the book. Rain ticked upon the slate roof. Somewhere beneath the staddle stones, a rat scratched, as though auditioning for a conscience. Whimsy rose and studied the heavy iron latch. Barred from within, yet the bar slides easily, no warping. Any secondary entrance? Only the loft hatch, said Miss Pym, pointing overhead. But one needs a ladder outside. Bunter trained the lantern upward. The hatch, an unpainted square, was secured by a hook driven through the center from below. Whimsy scribbled, hatch latched downward, impossible from without. He moved to the corner where a little cast-iron stove exhaled the ghost of burnt coal. Ashes still warm, a kettle perched upon it, empty and dry. Odd vigor for a granary stove at harvest's end, he murmured. Ashes raked, but not doused. Fuel wasted, unless someone required heat for another purpose. He dug with a penknife, exposing a twist of oily cloth, half consumed. Bunter, bag this if you would. Miss Pym shifted, cloak rustling. What purpose, Lord Peter? Patience, patience. An hypothesis is like port, dreadful when young, beguiling only with age. He smiled thinly. Now, your dairyman discovered the body at 6? Just past 5, in fact, she corrected. Mr. Pyle comes at cock-crow. Let us mark times precisely. Dawn today was 6:13 by the almanac, though your grandfather clock gave itself airs at 6:30. Your dairyman's watch? He owns none. He swears by the Angelus bell at St. Petrock's. Whimsy made a small humming sound. Bunter, a field trip. Oblige me by timing the walk from here to St. Petrock's Tower, returning at a brisk farmhand's pace. Bunter nodded, consulted his wristwatch, and departed into the drizzle. Whimsy turned back to the corpse with the weary tenderness of a physician triaging tragedy. Miss Pym, did Mr. Mallet keep a razor? In his cottage, yes. The constable has it, but Mr. Mallet was left-handed. As am I, though I shave with either, said Whimsy. He examined the cut, right to left, across the throat. Yet the handprint on that Bible, see? Thumb uppermost on the left page, fingers right. A right-hander placed the book. He straightened. When we conclude here, I must ask for a glance at your library. I wish to know where that volume once rested. It's the only black-letter Bible, she said quietly. It lives on the second shelf, between Fox's Acts and Monuments and a copy of The Whole Duty of Man. Charming neighbors for a violent end, Whimsy observed. Now, we must speak to anyone who touched that stove since yesterday. Only Mrs. Tarleton, Miss Pym replied. She warms mulled ale for the workers at dusk. Ale at 7, cold beef at 7:30, corpse discovered near dawn. The stove relit sometime in the night for purposes unknown. He stooped once more, fingertips skimming the dirt beside the sacks. Something glinted, a stiff thread of crimson silk, no thicker than a cat's whisker. He trapped it under the penknife blade and slipped it into an envelope. Footsteps sounded behind them. A tall, raw-boned youth in a soaked mackintosh stood at the threshold, cap clutched in nervous hands. "Beg your pardon, miss," he said to Miss Pym. "Constable sent me. Says Dr. Wycomb's on his way. Thought as how the gentleman detective might want a word afore we move him." "This is Tom Pyle?" Whimsy asked. "Yes, my lord," the boy answered. flushing. "I found Mr. William." His gaze flickered past Whimsy to the body, then away as though scorched. "Never seen such a thing." Whimsy's tone became almost gentle. "Steady on. You entered—" "How?" "Shoved the bar up with my pitchfork, sir. That was Mr. William's custom. He drops it at night for the rats, but it yields with a crack if you pry it." "There was resistance?" "Not a mite, and the lantern was lit." Tom shivered. Thought he'd fallen asleep reading. "I stepped in, saw the blood, ran for Miss Pym." "You touched nothing else?" "No, sir, except the pitchfork." Whimsy's pencil darted. "Was the stove already warm?" "Hot, sir. I near scalded my boot when I brushed it." Tom swallowed. But the ashes seemed new-laid, like someone had stoked up recent. Whimsy dismissed him with a nod and promised an official statement later. Tom retreated. Rain gusted, rattling the lantern and making its shadows caper over corpse and sacks. The draught Whimsy had earlier detected fluttered again beneath the door, warm, then cool, as though a bellows worked unseen. He bent, palm hovering near the threshold, and felt definite warmth westering from the yard. "Miss Pym," he said, "is Candlewick served by a culvert or flue, some conduit between buildings?" "A disused cider mill flue, yes, runs from the press shed hearth to a vent beside the granary. It draws the smoke away when we dry apples." "Ah," his eyes shone. "Who last fired the cider hearth?" "Not since Wednesday. And today is Friday, which means a clever person had a hollow pipe from press to granary unnoticed by prying eyes, capable of carrying more than smoke." He tapped the toe of his brogue upon the floorboards. The wood returned a hard, even note, save for one plank, which issued a dull thud. Whimsy knelt and traced its edge. A hairline saw-cut circled the plank's outline. "Bunter would call this a trap," he murmured. Voices outside preceded newcomer footsteps. Bunter returned with droplets jewelling his shoulders, and behind him tramped Inspector Cowper, a florid Devonshire man with a moustache like a walrus out of sorts. Dr. Wycombe, neat as a pewter button, trailed carrying a black bag. "Ah, Whimsy." Cowper's tone suggested he bore crosses enough without dilettante peers meddling. "Still poking the ashes. I shall trouble you to quit the stage for the professionals." "My dear Cowper," said Whimsy mildly, "I should be sickened to impede devotion, yet permit me one small observation before you draw the curtain. This," he indicated the corpse, "did not perish by its own hand. I submit the presence of a silk thread, a soaped cuff, and a stove curiously abused. Furthermore, unless Dr. Wycombe can prove Mr. Mallet bled uphill, the lack of arterial spatter demands relocation post-mortem." Cowper snorted. "Locked room, barred latch, no footprint save the dairyman's. How else but self-slaughter?" "Quite," Whimsy replied, smiling without mirth. Devilishly obliging of the deceased to make it simple. Yet a minor puzzle persists. Who replaced Miss Pym's grandfather clock? It now runs 4 minutes slow, contrary to its usual vanity. A meddler desperate to certify a false hour. But why meddle with a clock unless one needs an alibi to chime? Cowper started to retort, but Whimsy's gaze had already wandered to the Bible, open like a mouth that refused to close. "Doctor, would you check the cadaver's palms? Ink, perhaps." Wycombe obliged, twisting a wrist beneath the lantern. There, faint yet certain, smudged whirls of printer's ink darkened the fingertips. Whimsy's eyebrow arched. "Thank you. Cowper, when you've catalogued this scene, kindly compare that ink to the press in Miss Pym's attic, the same press once used to label cider crates. My suspicion is the Bible's ribbon marker was not chosen by piety, but by page number, chapter 34, verse 5, set to implicate divine vengeance." A theatrical flourish, yes. Yet the killer neglected one thing. Printer's ink is obstinate. Cowper looked both irritated and intrigued. And your alternative narrative? Merely budding. For the present, secure the flue between press and granary. See whether a man might crawl it or contrive a draught to spirit away smoke. Smoke that, mingled with potash soap's ammonia, could lull a sleeper. Meanwhile, I intend to interview Mrs. Tarleton on the subject of mulled ale, and perhaps examine her supply of cinnamon sticks, surely innocent enough unless one grinds them to disguise a drug. With that, he tipped his hat to Miss Pym and sauntered into the rain, leaving the inspector to scowl at an open Bible and a still bleeding mystery. Behind Whimsy, Bunter replaced the ribbon seal upon the latch as deferentially as he might straighten a pew's hassock. And so Candlewick Farm, though convinced the worst had already happened, found its night only beginning, for the quiet man in the trilby had started asking questions, and every question tightened a thread of crimson silk round someone's unsuspecting throat. The farmhouse kitchen exhaled a comforting fug of damp coats, parsnip peelings, and residual anxiety as Whimsy stepped through the back door. Mrs. Tarleton, a woman whose silhouette suggested she never passed a plate without tasting it first, was already setting down the kettle with suspicious speed. Her large face, the color of clotted cream and just as opaque, turned toward him with a stiff kind of welcome. "Good evening, my lord. Didn't hear you come in." "I rather hoped not," Whimsy said lightly, brushing a droplet of cider-press soot from his lapel. "Lends one an air of mystery. Might I trouble you for a brief word before your cinnamon cools?" She blinked. "Cinnamon? Forgive me. The mulled ale. Miss Pym mentioned you prepared it for the men folk last night." "Oh, aye. Just a warm drink to see them through the cold. Made it like I always do. Dash of ginger, nutmeg, stick of cinnamon, pinch of clove. Nothing harmful in it, I'll swear. I'm sure it was entirely medicinal." He folded himself into the fireside settle, long legs arranged like geometry. "But I'm curious. Did you set any aside afterward?" "For Mr. Mallett's say?" She paused, dish towel caught between her fists. "Not exactly. He weren't in the kitchen when I brought it in. I set a mug on the sideboard. He always fetched it later." "And was the mug empty this morning?" Her lips thinned. "I couldn't say. I didn't notice. But you washed it?" "I always do," she said defensively. "First thing, I'm not one to leave things lying about." Whimsy smiled without showing teeth. "Quite. Tell me, Mrs. Tarleton, do you keep laudanum in the house?" Her brows climbed. "Certainly not. Miss Pym don't allow anything stronger than chamomile, and even that in moderation." "Wise policy," said Whimsy, "and yet potash soap in the cider barn, reeking ashes in the granary stove, and a victim too deeply asleep to flinch. One begins to suspect someone supplemented the ginger." He stood. "Would you be kind enough to show me your spice rack?" She hesitated, then nodded and waddled to a high shelf where an old tobacco tin sat nestled among tins of barley and bags of flour. Whimsy accepted it delicately and opened the lid. Inside were curls of cinnamon, a nugget of dried ginger, 3 clove heads, and a thin film of fine white powder clinging to the bottom, as if the tin had recently held something more volatile. He dipped a pinky finger and brought it delicately to his tongue. "Ah, not cinnamon, a shade too bitter. May I take this to the doctor?" Mrs. Tarleton said nothing, only turned back to the stove, the dish towel wrung so tight it looked ready to rend. Outside, the wind had changed, swinging round to the east and carrying with it the sound of the sea moaning against the coastal cliffs. Whimsy returned to the granary just as Cowper was descending from the loft, his moustache bristling with reluctant respect. "You were right," he muttered. "That flue's wide enough for a cat, not a man, but one might draw smoke through it. Someone relit that stove in the night, right enough, and the trap board under the oat sacks leads to a crawl space, not deep, but dry. Your man could have crawled up from the cider barn and out through the loft hatch easy if the outer ladder was placed in time. Bunter timed the walk from the press to St. Petrock's and back. 7 minutes if one strides briskly. That's enough time for our killer to slip out unseen before the Angelus bell and leave Mr. Mallet propped as though he'd never moved. Whimsy produced the spiced tin. But consider, too, the means of sedation. Mrs. Tarleton's cinnamon may contain more than Christmas cheer. Dr. Wycombe took the tin, sniffed, and frowned. Bitter, not aconite, something synthetic. Perhaps chloral hydrate. I'll test it. Please do. And if the post-mortem confirms ingestion rather than shock as the agent of collapse, we'll be halfway to proving murder. Cowper cleared his throat. You said the clock was tampered with. Indeed, said Whimsy. Miss Pym's grandfather clock, usually 4 minutes fast, now runs 4 slow. Someone altered it deliberately to support an artificial timeline, perhaps to suggest Mallet was last seen alive later than he truly was. And you think our killer slipped out through the cider shed? If he knew the farm, Whimsy said, he could time his approach to the flue, light the fire to lull Mallet with smoke and fumes, climb the ladder unseen, and plant the Bible and wounds after the victim was insensible. A romantic gesture, in a gruesome sort of way. Isaiah 34:5. My sword shall be bathed in heaven. Bit theatrical, Cowper grunted. They usually are, said Whimsy. It takes a peculiar kind of egotism to stage one's own scripture. They paused as a shape approached from the lane, a bicycle lamp bobbing through the mist, resolving into a man with the round shoulders and angular grace of a failed poet or a successful librarian. He dismounted and raised his cap. Evening, he said. I'm Paul Lavington. Miss Pym sent word I might be of help. Whimsy extended a hand. Lord Peter Whimsy, I understand you were close to the deceased. Lavington flinched. Yes. William and I were boys together. I was best man at his wedding, such as it was. Ah, yes, Whimsy said. His late wife. Perhaps you can tell me about her. Miss Pym implied she met a tragic end. Poor thing, Lavington murmured. Took herself off the cliffs 2 years ago, just after Candlemas. They said she was melancholy by nature, but I never believed it. She wasn't the type. Then what was the type? Whimsy's tone was conversational, as though discussing an eccentric aunt. Lavington hesitated. She was, well, theatrical, dressed in black even before she needed to. Quoted The Mysteries of Udolpho at supper, that sort. And her relationship with William? They fought. Quietly. Always quietly. She resented the farm. Said Candlewick was a tomb. Whimsy's eyes glinted. And now he lies in the granary, beside oats and cider and a Bible stabbed through Isaiah. Very well. He turned to Cowper. I should like to see Mallet's cottage next. I fancy we may find a letter, or at least a clue to whoever wanted to restage Candlemas. The cottage was a squat stone affair with ivy clinging like a strangler. Inside, a brass bed sat beneath a crossbeam from which a faded sprig of holly still dangled. Bunter found no lock on the writing desk, which contained only a few unpaid bills, a small photograph of the late Mrs. Mallet in Edwardian lace, and, tucked within a book of Psalms, a note in tight, nervy script. The hour approaches. I have repented. What is written shall be made flesh, and judgment given. I will not run this time. I shall face her. Whimsy read it aloud. Cowper's brows rose. Her? His wife? Or her proxy, said Whimsy. Someone playing the part. Theatricality again. And repentance. It sounds like someone under moral pressure. Perhaps manipulated. Perhaps drugged. He closed the Psalms and replaced the note. We are looking, Cowper, for a person who knew the workings of the flue, the timings of the house, the temper of William Mallet, and the temperature at which cinnamon conceals chloral hydrate. Someone with access to Mrs. Tarleton's spices, Miss Pym's clock, and Mallet's fears. And who knew the Bible well enough to choose that verse, added Bunter. Yes, said Whimsy, not just any Bible verse, one with bloody imagery and damnation from a book rarely quoted by the innocent. He gazed once more at the photograph of the dead wife. Dark hair, long fingers, shadowed eyes. She dressed like a Gothic heroine, he said. And perhaps someone decided the drama wasn't over. Whimsy's fingers lingered an instant on the photograph, almost as if he expected the somber young woman to speak. Then he slipped it back into its cracked frame and nodded for Bunter to relock the desk. The lamp on the cottage table guttered. A draught murmured through the casement, rattling peg and hinge like a stage cue no one had planned. Outside, night had hardened to a tar-colored stillness, the drizzle reduced to a cold mist that haloed every lantern flare. "Inspector," Whimsy said at last, "I should like Mr. Lavington kept within reach, but not harassed. He knows something, one can feel a confession trembling behind his polite vowels. But it will require the proper leverage." Cowper grunted. "And what lever do you propose? He seems a sensitive fellow." "Precisely. Sentiment is often the most obliging fulcrum." Whimsy's gaze wandered to the holly sprig dangling from the beam. "Remnants of Candlemas decorations," he observed. "Odd to leave them hanging so long." "Bit of country superstition," Cowper supplied. "They say removing it before midsummer invites ill luck. Or removes a convenient alibi," Whimsy murmured, but offered no further explanation. Bunter had been nosing about the hearth. He straightened, produced a tattered theatre program, and passed it across. Whimsy unfolded it. "St. James's Playhouse, February matinee. Shakespeare's Richard III, featuring Mr. Paul Lavington as Duke of Clarence." A corner bore a dab of the same crimson silk he had found beside Mallet. Whimsy's brows arched. "Bunter, your photographic eye remains my salvation. Our Mr. Lavington appears fonder of the stage than a village librarian has any right to be." Cowper sniffed. "Hobby horse. He rides to Exeter twice a month for theatricals." "No doubt, yet a hobby may gallop further than one intends. Pray guard this program. It may prove to have ridden clear into murder." Whimsy slipped it into an envelope, then turned to the door. "We must return to the house. There is a conversation with Miss Pym's grandfather clock still pending." They stepped back through the orchard. The mist had thickened, blurring torches and turning every apple tree into a pale, skeletal sentinel. Halfway, Whimsy paused and stooped. A faint track of disturbed earth led from the cider shed's back wall toward a gap in the hedge. He knelt, struck a match, and examined the soil, a fine sprinkle of white around each impression. "Wood ash," he said softly. "Someone carried smoldering fuel across here. But why risk sparks in damp grass unless one feared leaving a trail within the yard?" Cowper crouched beside him. "It rained most of the night. Those prints can't be more than a few hours old." "Precisely. Sometime after Mallet's death and after the dairyman's discovery. An after visit, perhaps to retrieve something or erase it." They followed the line to the hedge gap, where broken twigs revealed a recent passage. On the far side, the prints vanished into bracken that sloped down to the cliff path. The sea growled below, invisible but vast. Whimsy straightened and drew in a lungful of salt air. "We shall return, come daylight," he said, "before footprints fade altogether." Back in the farmhouse hall, the grandfather clock squatted, ticking with what now sounded like deliberate insolence. Whimsy rested his ear against its glass and listened for a dozen beats, then opened the door and adjusted the pendulum nut with surgeonly care. He closed the case and compared the dial to his wristwatch. 4 minutes and 38 seconds. "Slow," he announced. "Someone with a finer sense of melodrama than horology." Miss Pym bustled in, shawl flapping like a startled crow. "Lord Peter, do you tamper with my poor father's clock?" "I merely rectify an insult done it by heavier hands," he replied. "Tell me, ma'am, who winds the old fellow?" "Why, I do on Sundays, and Mrs. Tarleton dusts it of a Tuesday." "And yesterday?" he asked gently. She cast her mind back. She complained the clock felt gritty. I fear the cider dust gets everywhere in harvest. She may have opened it to wipe. Thank you. Whimsy exchanged a glance with Bunter. We must verify her enthusiasm for cleanliness. Meanwhile, Miss Pym, might we inspect your library? I wish to see the gap left by the missing Bible. She guided them to a low-ceilinged parlor lined with oak shelves. Foxes, acts, and monuments loomed like a penitentiary brick beside the whole duty of man. Between them, a narrow vacancy gaped. Whimsy passed a finger along the shelf and emerged with a crescent of clear wood outlined by accrued dust. Removed recently, he murmured, else the dust would blur. Bunter, photograph, if you please. As Bunter prepared his apparatus, Whimsy's gaze ranged the rest of the shelves. A thin volume bound in red calf caught his eye. The Tragedy of Richard III, prompt copy. He tugged it free. Inside, penciled notations cramped the margins, chiefly stage directions and cues. One line, underscored thrice, read, Clarence's dream. The souls of all that I had murdered came to my tent. He showed it to Cowper. Our amateur actor keeps his texts close at hand, and Miss Pym lets him ferret among her books. She colored. Paul is often here helping with the accounts. If he borrowed something, I'd not notice. Ah, Cowper muttered. So Lavington stages tragedies by day, helps with the ledgers by night. An obliging soul, Whimsy agreed. Yet he did not borrow the Bible. It interests him less than Shakespeare. He slid the prompt copy back and turned to Miss Pym. Pray, who in this household reads Scripture most devoutly? She considered. William did, since his wife's death, and Mrs. Tarleton keeps a prayer book. Tom Pyle. Only the racing pages of the news, she said faintly. Then we may presume our murderer either is William, highly inconvenient, being dead, or someone who knew of his habit and knew how to weaponize it. He tapped the shelf. May I carry this prompt copy away? Of course. They retired again to the kitchen for hot tea. Mrs. Tarleton, pale but steady, served without word. Whimsy watched her movements, the quick, practiced scoop of leaves, the tidy wipe of spoon on saucer rim. No powder lingered in any crease of her fingers. They were scrubbed raw. When she retreated, Cowper leaned in. What's your measure of her? Capable of drugging ale, Whimsy conceded, yet her sense of order wars with theatricality. Remember Mallet's pose and Scripture, that reeks of someone who revels in drama. He sipped. No, she may be accomplice unwitting, but not principal. A knock rattled the back door. Dr. Wycombe entered, peeling off gloves. Preliminary, he said, pulling a small vial from his pocket. Your powder is indeed chloral hydrate, enough to fell a man in minutes if stirred into hot ale. And the stomach contents concur. Mallet swallowed a dose an hour before death. He glanced at Miss Pym, who had drifted in at the news. Apologies, madam. She pressed a handkerchief to her mouth, but nodded for him to continue. Blade wound was post-mortem, tidy, little bleeding. Your killer slit him only to stage murder, though in fact it was murder from the first draft. Thank you, doctor, Whimsy said softly. That clears the fog somewhat. Cowper, you now possess poisoning, staging, red silk, Scripture, and clock tinkering, all timed around the Angelus bell. He stood. I shall hazard one more inspection before bed. Bunter and I will walk to St. Petrock's Tower. The path skirted the fields where mist flattened everything into silhouettes. Bunter carried an electric torch, its beam cutting tunnels through damp air. The church sat lonely on a knoll, Norman Tower square against the murk. A single lamp burned within, casting stained glass ghosts onto the grass. Whimsy pushed the heavy door, its side open without protest. Inside, candles guttered on the altar. Someone had tended them recently. The nave smelled of wax, old hymnals, and something chemical. Sharp, lingering. "Incense?" Bunter whispered. "Perhaps." Whimsy raised the torch. A vestment chest stood half open beneath the tower stairs. He lifted a white surplice. A smudge of printer's ink marked the hem. Nearby, on a peg, hung a cassock cord, dyed a vivid crimson, a few threads frayed at the end. "Red silk again," he murmured. "And ink. A printer's hand has been at work, even in the sacristy." Footsteps clattered above. Whimsy doused the torch. A shadow loomed on the stair landing, tall, cloaked. It hesitated, then began descending. Bunter stepped forward, a silhouette of discreet readiness. The figure paused, backlit by an arrow-slit window. A voice, low and strained, said, "Is someone there?" "Indeed," replied Whimsy cheerfully, switching the torch back on. Light spilled over the newcomer, Paul Lavington, still in his bicycle mackintosh, eyes wide as shuttered lamps. "Lord Peter, you startled me. I often come here to think. To rehearse, perhaps." Whimsy lifted the surplice. "Do you favor Hamlet's ghost at midnight? Or Clarence's drowned lament?" Lavington flushed. "These belong to the church. I would never—" "Forgive me. Yet you dabble in theatricals, haunted by old roles. Tell me, do you print programs yourself?" "Yes," he said cautiously. "I have a small press in the village." "Why?" "Because printer's ink clings like original sin," Whimsy answered, pointing to the surplice hem, "and it marks both Bible ribbon and corpse's fingertips. Mallet may have set type for your playbills, did he not?" "He helped me on weekends," Lavington admitted. "He was good with machinery. And perhaps last night you and he argued." Whimsy's voice was soft, confessional. "About your late wife. His late wife. Who was she to you, Paul? Beyond an old acquaintance?" The man's shoulders sagged. "We were cousins. Close ones. I introduced them, God help me. She wrote me letters after the wedding, miserable letters. She feared him, said Candlewick smothered her." "A Gothic tomb indeed," Whimsy murmured. "Did you keep those letters?" "They're in my rooms," Lavington said faintly. "I was bringing them to William by way of warning, but he accused me of driving her to despair. We quarreled." "So you spiced his ale?" "No." Lavington stepped back. "I left after supper. He was alive, sullen but alive. I came here to ring the bell. It was nearly 9. "The Angelus," Bunter supplied. "Yes. I sometimes help old Sexton Bray. He was ill, so I told it, I swear." Whimsy regarded him a moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well. We shall verify with Bray." He placed the supplice back. "But remember, Mr. Lavington, truth, like scripture, may be twisted if one omits a verse. Omissions often hang men faster than lies." They parted at the lich gate, Lavington cycling away into fog. Whimsy watched the bobbing lamp until it vanished. "Do you believe him, my lord?" Bunter asked. "Not entirely. But neither does he smell of chloral. We have another actor yet unmasked, one who prefers kitchens to chancels." He sighed. "Tomorrow we must search Mrs. Tarleton's spice cupboard for fingerprints and inspect that small village press. Ink, Bunter, is our red thread." They turned back toward Candlewick, the sea sighing below like an audience awaiting the next act's curtain. In the orchard, the apple trees had begun to drip again, each leaf releasing a single bead that struck the ground like the tick of a death-watch beetle counting down to revelation. The next morning broke damp and grey, with the air thick as lard and the clouds stooping low over Candlewick's moss-laden eaves. A soft fog clung to the hedgerows, rendering the fields dreamlike but faintly sour-smelling, like linen packed too long in a damp chest. Whimsy was already dressed, and on his second cup of tea when Bunter, meticulous as a ritual acolyte, laid out the day's tools, clean gloves, pocket magnifier, and a folded sheet of notepaper that bore the lines from Clarence's dream, now copied out in Bunter's precise hand. "I thought," Bunter said mildly, "you might wish to test how well one recalls a text when reciting it under strain." "Indeed, Bunter," Whimsy replied, lifting the note and scanning it with narrowed eyes. "Strain or sentiment, either may distort quotation, but seldom in quite the same way. Misspoke lines are a detective's lodestone." Cowper arrived minutes later, exhaling hard through his mustache. "Bray confirms Lavington rang the bell. He was too ill to mount the tower steps, and the boy from the grocer's fetched him some laudanum at 8:30. But there's no saying what happened before or after. Bray sleeps like a stone." "No stone sleeps so conveniently," Whimsy said, and rose. "Come. Before dew and sheep obliterate our nocturnal footprints, we must revisit the orchard path. That smudge of ash and those broken twigs still whisper something." The path behind the cider shed remained damp but undisturbed since the previous night. Whimsy crouched again at the hedge gap. The trail led into a thicket of gorse and stunted blackthorn that curled down toward the sea. This morning, the bracken steamed faintly in the sun's first half-hearted effort. As they descended, a glint caught Whimsy's eye, a fragment of red cloth snagged on a thorn, no longer than a thumbnail, and unmistakably silk. He extracted it carefully and passed it to Bunter, who sealed it in waxed paper with reverence. "So either our killer fled by this route," Whimsy said, "or returned. Odd, is it not, how quickly guilt seeks the sea?" "Do you think they dropped something?" Cowper asked. "No, I think they checked something, perhaps to ensure it had been well hidden." Further down, the path forked, one trail meandering toward the chalk edge, the other doubling back to the rear of the village. Whimsy opted for the latter, leading them by the side of St. Petrock's to the low stone cottage beside the old forge. The window bore a neatly painted sign. "Lavington and Son, printing and typesetting, appointments by letter." "Amateur hours," Whimsy murmured, "but passion knows no schedule." The lock was simple. Cowper knocked, and when no answer came, he produced a key from the constable's satchel. "Lavington keeps a spare with Mrs. Arbour next door. She won't object." Inside, the air smelled of paper and linseed. A press of modest dimensions sat in the corner, its rollers dry but ink-stained. Nearby, several lead-type trays lay open, letters in tidy rows. Whimsy began sifting through the discard bin, offcuts of posters, spoiled test sheets, and fragments of poetry. He drew one out, a draft of a funeral program for one Helena Alice Mallet, dated 6 months past. "She was buried from the village chapel, not the farmhouse," Whimsy remarked, "but this has a misprinted hymn number. Lavington seems to have discarded it. Sloppy for a man of taste." Bunter had been inspecting the tools on the sideboard. He lifted a ruler with a smear of red wax. "Sealing ribbon," he said. "Pressed into typeface. See the indentations?" "Someone made an impression," Whimsy agreed. "Now, what might they have wished to replicate?" They searched the drawers and uncovered a small, folded pamphlet titled Scriptural Testaments for Use in Reflection and Reproof. Within it, one verse stood out, Job 33:14-18, printed in scarlet ink and underlined. "For God speaketh once, yea twice, yet man perceiveth it not. In a dream, in a vision of the night." The passage mirrored Clarence's dream in cadence, uneasily so. "A man obsessed with sin and justice," Cowper muttered. "Or with the poetry of damnation," Whimsy added. "This is performance, Inspector, not passion." Bunter came forward with a faint smile. "My lord, I found this among the blank sheets." He handed Whimsy a small card, still damp at the corner. "Candlewick Dramatic Society, Easter Production, Julius Caesar. Rehearsals begin March 10th. "Rehearsals indeed," Whimsy said. "Then our actor has not retired entirely. But why the secrecy? Lavington is permitted his amusements." They locked up and stepped into the lane. A slow bell tolled across the village, the half hour, Whimsy guessed, from Candlewick's persistent clock. He pulled out his watch and nodded. Still lagging by 4.5 minutes. Our killer tampered with it, possibly to align the sound with their alibi. Could be anyone who passed through the hall, Cowper said. Even Miss Pym. Yes, Whimsy said absently. But not everyone knows the pendulum nut from the bell crank. They returned to the farmhouse, where Miss Pym met them on the step, clearly distraught. Lord Peter, it's Mrs. Tarleton. She's fainted in the dairy. I sent Tom for Dr. Wycombe. Whimsy followed her briskly. The dairy reeked of curdling milk and faint vinegar. Mrs. Tarleton sat on a stool, pale and dazed, one hand trembling on her apron. On the table lay a small tin marked Murray's Calming Powders. She said she opened the spice cupboard to fetch cloves, Miss Pym whispered, and something fell. A little cloth bag wrapped in muslin. She's never seen it before. Whimsy stepped inside and found the cupboard door ajar. On the top shelf, behind the bay leaves, a square of muslin poked out from a cracked jar. He reached in and drew out a pouch, knotted with silk cord. Opening it revealed a powder, greyish-white, faintly aromatic. Chloral hydrate, he said, turning to Cowper. And not industrial grade. This is refined, measured, intended for ingestion. Cowper snapped his notebook open. So it was stored in the spice cupboard? Yes, hidden, but not cleverly. A cook reaches for bay leaves daily. Our killer knew the location would only suffice for hours, enough to mislead a superficial search. He turned to Mrs. Tarleton, who blinked blearily at him. Madam, has anyone besides you and Miss Pym entered this kitchen since the day before yesterday? She shook her head. Only Paul. He fetched a plate when he stayed for dinner. And Tom, for a lantern. No one else. And what did Paul take to drink? She hesitated. Ale, same as Mr. Mallet. I poured it into mugs. But I think I left the tray a moment. Tom shouted for more salt. I went to the pantry. Leaving the mugs unattended? Yes, but only for a second. Whimsy straightened. Long enough. They waited in the parlor until Wycombe arrived. He examined Mrs. Tarleton and administered a draught. Shock, mostly, but keep her warm and away from the dairy. Whimsy handed him the muslin pouch. Would you confirm its contents at your leisure, Doctor? It completes our inventory nicely. Once Wycombe had gone, Whimsy turned to Miss Pym. Would you mind if I had a brief word with Tom? Tom Pyle appeared minutes later, cap in hand. His face was drawn, but his eyes were sharp with curiosity. Tom, Whimsy said kindly, do you remember where Mr. Lavington went after dinner the night Mallet died? The boy hesitated. He went out through the front, said he needed air. And the mugs. I saw 2 on the tray, both with that fancy handle. He always gets the one with the dog's head 'cause he likes it. Did he swap them? Tom blinked. I don't know. I went for salt. When I came back, they were still there. Did he seem nervous? Sweaty, maybe? No, sir. But he did hum. That funny little song, Poor Soul of Mine, or something. I didn't know the tune. Whimsy and Bunter exchanged a glance. Richard III again, Whimsy said softly. Clarence's speech. The dream. He turned to Cowper. Inspector, we are nearly there. I should like all involved gathered tonight at 9 in the parlour, with the grandfather clock striking, if you please, and I shall require the stage, complete with props. Props? Yes. A mug, a Bible, a red cord, and a sound no one can quite place, until it is too late. He smiled thinly. The curtain is ready to rise. At precisely 9 o'clock, the Candlewick farmhouse sat in breathless quiet, its lamps dimmed to a soft amber. The great-grandfather clock wound and waited, its pendulum counting out a slow, deliberate rhythm. In the parlour, chairs had been drawn in a semicircle around the hearth, the air tinged with beeswax polish and something sour beneath it. Old smoke, perhaps, or anticipation. Lord Peter Whimsy stood by the fireplace, long fingers steepled. Inspector Cowper lingered beside the door with a constable not far behind. Bunter moved among the assembled figures like a stage manager, offering water, adjusting the placement of a small table where a silver mug, a red silk cord, and a battered King James Bible had been carefully laid out. No one spoke. Present were Miss Pym, pale but composed; Mrs. Tarleton, bundled in a shawl, her eyes swollen from earlier tears; Tom Pyle, sitting upright, with both hands clenched on his knees; and finally, Paul Lavington, his expression unreadable, though a muscle in his jaw worked steadily as the clock ticked on. Whimsy turned to the room, his voice casual. "Thank you for coming. I appreciate that these have been trying days, but I believe, indeed I'm sure, we are now in possession of all the facts required to explain the death of Mr. Julius Mallet." There was a subtle shift, posture, breath, a tightening of silence. Whimsy picked up the Bible, weighing it lightly in his palm. "The motive," he said, "was not jealousy nor money, not even fear. It was performance, but not the kind that earns applause." He looked to Lavington. "You loved language, didn't you? Not just type or layout, but words themselves, their rhythm, their music, and more than that, you loved what they could do." Lavington did not respond. His eyes remained on the Bible. Whimsy continued, "Let us consider Clarence's dream, the vivid description of sinking into darkness, of voices reciting fragments of Scripture. The same lines appear in the booklet you printed for your own use, the same imagery in your discarded poetry drafts." "I print for half the village," Lavington said finally, his voice dry. "Quotes are a common currency." "Indeed, but a dream is not," Whimsy said. "Not unless someone plants it. And dreams planted with such specificity tend to come from a source both intimate and calculated." He walked to the clock, gesturing toward its polished casing. "We know the grandfather clock's chime was altered, its striking delayed by exactly 4.5 minutes on the night of the murder. That manipulation required knowledge of its weights and flywheel system. It's not merely a matter of winding. It takes someone mechanically inclined, someone like a printer who resets lead type with millimetric precision." Still, Lavington said nothing. Whimsy picked up the silver mug and turned it in the light. "Here's where the real trick lay. The laudanum, traces were found in Mallet's mug, but the dosage wasn't enough to kill. It was merely enough to dull him, blur the senses, ensure he missed the bitterness that came next. The chloral hydrate was the killer. Mixed with ale, it left few immediate signs. But it works quickly, slows breath, slackens the pulse. Painless, efficient." Mrs. Tarleton flinched visibly. "You couldn't have dosed both mugs. You had to know which one he'd take. So you engineered a little ritual. Mallet always chose the same cup, the one with the dog's head handle, and you, Lavington, made sure it was ready for him." Miss Pym spoke then, voice low. "But why? Why would Paul—" "Because he couldn't forgive," Whimsy said softly. "Not Mallet, and not himself." He looked at Lavington. "You were in love with her, Helena." For the first time, Lavington looked up. His eyes were glassy, with a hatred so tightly wound it had nowhere left to go. "I was," he said, "until he got to her. She came back, different, smaller, quieter, always watching the door. She was afraid. She was shamed. He told her it wasn't love. It was biology, he said. An experiment. Then he spread the tale around his club. She knew. She found the letter." Whimsy laid down the mug and came to stand directly before him. Her death was ruled accidental, but she fell from a height, a cliff edge, and Mallet said she'd been distraught. We now understand why. "She left me nothing," Lavington said, voice catching. "Not even the truth, just that terrible silence. And he carried on. Sunday dinners, laughter, whiskey by the fire. It was all so easy for him. But not for you. Whimsy said gently. No. So I gave him a stage. Let him dream what it was like. The cold, the water, the long drop. There was a long silence in the room, filled only by the low tick of the clock and the faint sighing of wind in the chimney. You fed him his own sins, Cowper said after a moment. Slowly. Like medicine. Lavington smiled bitterly. I wrote him a dream, set it in motion, watched him stumble toward it day by day. It was perfect. It was murder, Whimsy said quietly. The smile disappeared. Yes, Lavington said. And what of it? Bunter stepped forward and placed a small envelope on the table. Whimsy opened it and withdrew a sheet. Helena Mallett's last letter, never posted, folded around a pressed flower, scarlet flax. It had been found wedged behind a drawer in her old bureau, discovered when Miss Pym finally cleared the room for the spring cleaning she could never bring herself to finish. I think you should see this, Whimsy said, and handed it to Lavington. The printer took it without a word. His hands trembled. His mouth worked silently. He read it once, then again, then lowered it to his lap. She was leaving him, Whimsy said. She meant to go to London, to begin again. She mentioned you by name. Said she hoped you'd still— Enough, Lavington whispered. But the truth, once named, would not be hushed. She never got the chance, Whimsy said. And now, nor shall you. Cowper crossed the room and gently placed a hand on Lavington's shoulder. Mr. Lavington, he said, I'm arresting you for the murder of Julius Mallet. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be taken down and— Lavington stood stiffly and nodded. I understand, he said. No curtain call. He did not resist as they led him from the room. When the door had closed, the silence returned, this time tinged with something less tense, more mournful. Tom sat with his head down, fists still tight. Miss Pym dabbed at her eyes, and Mrs. Tarleton looked as if she might faint again. Whimsy crossed to the fire and stirred the logs, letting sparks leap upward. It's the words, he said quietly. They haunt us, even when we think we've escaped their weight. Bunter cleared the table, careful with the mug and the Bible. Cowper lingered by the door. You think he regrets it? Whimsy glanced up. No, he said, but he will. The clock chimed the half-hour. Precise now, unaltered. A clean, honest tone. Somewhere far off, beyond the orchard and the salt grass, the sea whispered against the cliffside. The performance was over, but the echoes, as ever, would linger. The morning after the arrest dawned grey and slow, with a chalky mist curling over the hedgerows like a cat with secrets. Candlewick Farm stood quiet again. Too quiet, if one judged by the habits of its usual life. Even the crows, who had previously taken loud exception to Whimsy's presence, seemed subdued as he stood outside beneath the dripping eaves, smoking a Turkish cigarette with contemplative solemnity. I suppose, said Inspector Cowper, appearing at his elbow with the faint air of a man who had not slept so much as waited out the night. That's the end of it. Whimsy turned his head slightly, blew a spiral of smoke toward a passing spider. Is it? He said. Or have we merely concluded the performance with a satisfactory villain and a smattering of applause? Cowper frowned. You don't think Lavington did it? Oh, no, he did it, said Whimsy mildly, but I begin to wonder whether he did it quite alone. The inspector stiffened slightly. You mean there's an accomplice? Not in the legal sense, Whimsy mused, though I dare say the law might consider aiding and abetting under certain circumstances. No, I mean something subtler. Someone who didn't administer the poison, but without whom the performance could never have taken the shape it did. Cowper's gaze sharpened. You're referring to Miss Pym. Not accusing, Whimsy corrected. Referring. There's a shade of difference. Let's say I suspect she knows rather more than she has admitted. But as yet, no proof, no confession, and no tangible stake. Merely a tone, a hesitation, something brittle where it ought to be tender. He crushed the cigarette under his heel. Tell me, Cowper, have you ever seen a woman conceal love? Conceal it? They usually do the opposite. Ah, Whimsy smiled faintly. Then you have never met the devoted spinster who mistakes self-sacrifice for moral superiority. I do wonder what would have happened if Miss Pym had said something 5 years ago, when Helena was alive. Cowper grunted. You think she knew about the affair? I think she knew about everything, said Whimsy. But knowing and acting are not the same. They were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Tarleton, who emerged from the back door with a shawl around her shoulders, and a bowl of scraps for the hens, but whose expression suggested more than poultry on her mind. She hovered near the path, eyes flicking toward them, with a theatrical reluctance that clearly sought an invitation. Whimsy obliged her with a courtly nod. Something troubling your peace, madam? She pursed her lips. It's just that, well, I thought perhaps you ought to know I heard someone last night, in the library. Whimsy's brow arched. At what time? Just past midnight. I went down to fetch a tonic, my nerves, you know, and the light was on in the little hall. I heard a voice, reading aloud, slow and clear like in church. Gave me the goose flesh. Reading what? She hesitated. Scripture, I think. Or poetry. I'm no judge. But I know what I heard. Whimsy exchanged a glance with Cowper. Anyone else up at that hour? Mrs. Tarleton sniffed. Certainly not. We've all had enough fright. I locked the kitchen myself at 10:30. No one passed me. Very good, said Whimsy. I shall investigate. With Bunter in tow, Whimsy re-entered the house and made his way to the library. The air within was still faintly redolent of pipe smoke and lamp oil. Nothing appeared disturbed. The books neatly shelved, the rug precisely aligned, and the fire laid but not lit. He crossed to the desk and examined the writing slope. The blotter bore no fresh ink, but the corner of a book protruded from beneath a stack of old sermon pamphlets. He drew it out. It was a leather-bound volume of Donne's Meditations, well thumbed with marginalia in 2 hands, one firm, masculine, and slightly careless, the other small and neat. He flipped through and found a page folded sharply at the corner. No man is an island, Whimsy murmured. Each man's death diminishes me. He looked up at Bunter. Our departed printer had a taste for drama, but someone was reading this last night, and someone else was meant to hear it. He returned the book and straightened, his gaze lingering on the high window above the desk. It had been unlatched and opened slightly, the night air still lingering in the frame. Very neat, he said softly. Very theatrical. But who was the audience? He paused, considering. I think it's time I paid Miss Pym a morning call. They found her in the small glass conservatory adjoining the south parlour, pruning her pelargoniums with the grim focus of one trimming a funeral wreath. She looked up as they entered, her expression carefully composed. Lord Peter, she said, with the faintest dip of her chin, I suppose you've come to tell me it's all over. Something of the kind, he said, examining a broken stem on the tile floor. Though over is a curious word, is it not? Suggests finality where often there is only continuation. She frowned but said nothing. I spoke with Mrs. Tarleton, Whimsy said. She tells me someone was in the library last night. Reading aloud. Donne, if I'm not mistaken. A silence settled over the conservatory, broken only by the ticking of a wall clock and the soft snip of her shears as she trimmed another stem. Perfectly. Precisely. It was you, wasn't it? Whimsy said gently. Miss Pym's hand stilled. I thought I'd be alone, she said after a pause. I only meant to say goodbye. To whom? She turned to face him then, and her composure cracked like old china. To all of them, she said. To Paul, to Helena, to whatever this house has become. Whimsy inclined his head. You loved her. Yes, she said, but it wasn't the kind of love anyone writes poems about. It was fierce, fiercer than I understood. And when she died, and Paul began to wither, you said nothing. I couldn't say anything. I tried to forget it. I thought time would clear the air like a fog burning off at noon, but instead it settled, sank in. Whimsy studied her face. Did you suspect Paul of planning something? I didn't know until the day of the funeral, she whispered. I saw the way he stood by the grave, not grieving, watching, and I knew he'd done it, or at least engineered it. That was always his talent. Why not tell the police? Her hands tightened around the shears. Because I thought he deserved to finish it. Mallet had ruined them both. What would justice have done? Locked him up and left us all with half the story? And now? She looked away. Now I'm left with silence, but at least it's honest. Whimsy said nothing for a time. Then he rose. You understand that withholding information from an investigation is no small thing. I do, she said. Do what you must. But Whimsy shook his head. Miss Pym, he said, you've already sentenced yourself more thoroughly than any judge could. And with that, he left her to her pelargoniums in the slowly lengthening light as another hour marked its passing. And Candlewick waited. For what, it did not yet know. The cider press shed was quiet, save for the steady plink of last night's drizzle draining through warped shingles. Whimsy, coat collar up against the wan April wind, paced the length of the floorboards like a chess player rehearsing final moves. Bunter waited by the door, his calm presence as reliable as the iodine tang of fermenting pomace that lingered in the wood. It will not do, Bunter, Whimsy murmured, pausing to peer into the cold hearth where, 2 nights earlier, someone had coaxed embers to life and funneled their smoke along the flue. Our neat ending lacks conviction. A printer with chloral in his pocket and revenge in his heart is satisfyingly dramatic, yet there remains a false note, like a flute fractionally off-key in the adagio. He crouched and drew a gloved fingertip through pale ash upon the hearthstone. Chloral, scripture, clockwork. Lavington staged them all, certainly. But who set the stage? Who fetched the properties, rehearsed the cues? Bunter knelt beside him, producing from his case the muslin pouch recovered from the spice cupboard. Dr. Wycombe has confirmed, my lord. The knot is whipped with a double Flemish bend, unusual for a gentleman. Precisely. Whimsy lifted the cord end. The crimson silk thread was frayed exactly where he had found its twin on the granary floor and again snagged in the hedge. Needlework is a practical theology among gentlewomen. Printers, by contrast, trust the steadfast virtue of twine. He smiled thinly. Let us pay Miss Pym one more courtesy before luncheon. They crossed the yard just as Tom Pyle led the Shire horse toward the paddock. The lad touched his cap, but his eyes held lingering confusion. Justice, when it arrives, rarely resembles the stories told in taverns. Whimsy gave an encouraging nod, then mounted the stone steps to the kitchen door. Miss Pym received them in the hallway, shawl exchanged for a severe dark dress, whose only ornament was a silver brooch shaped like a heraldic knot. Her composure, though fragile, had been recast into something almost ceremonial. Lord Peter, she said. Inspector Cowper has gone to Witheridge with Paul. I trust there is no fresh calamity. Merely a dust mote that refuses to settle, Whimsy replied. Might we speak in private? She led them to the morning room. Spring light filtered through diamond panes, painted the carpet in faint checker. On a side table lay a half-finished piece of embroidery, scarlet floss against cream linen, the beginnings of an elaborate Tudor rose. The sheen of the thread matched too closely, the filament in Whimsy's pocket. He stopped beside it. Your needlecraft is exquisite, Miss Pym. She glanced at the frame. A habit of idle hands. Idle, perhaps. Never clumsy. He lifted the muslin pouch. "Do you recognize this knot?" For a fraction of a second, something flickered in her eyes, a candle guttered by sudden draught. Then she shook her head. "I cannot distinguish one knot from another." "Yet you tie them daily in floss and ribbon," Whimsy said, gently implacable. "This is a double Flemish bend, favored by sailors and, curiously, by ladies who hem altar cloths. I found its shredded twin on your hedge, snagged during a midnight errand. Would you care to tell me where you went that night?" Her fingers tightened around the back of a chair. "To the church," she admitted, after a pause. "Paul asked me to bring the cassock cord. He said the parson refused to lend it for his rehearsal." "Ah." Whimsy's tone was soft. "And did he explain why he required it drenched in printer's ink and stained with wax?" She closed her eyes. "He wanted verisimilitude. I thought, if the play were convincing, he might finally purge his torment." "So you helped," Whimsy said. "You took the cord, you opened the Bible case, you moved the grandfather clock." "No." The word came fierce, almost a plea. "The clock was Paul's doing. He knew the mechanism. But I fetched the Bible. Yes, and she faltered. "I brewed the mulled ale." Bunter's breath drew in sharply, but Whimsy merely inclined his head, waiting. "I did not know about the chloral," she went on. "I swear it. Paul said he needed a mild sedative, laudanum, to calm William, to make him listen. He gave me the drops to add. I believed him." A quiet, desperate laugh escaped her. "I who pride myself on discernment. I believed him." She sank into the chair. "When William died, I realized the scale of Paul's intent, but I thought, I must protect him. I could not lose both of them." "And so," Whimsy murmured, "you kept silent, trusting that silence would weigh less than truth. Yet secrets, like corpses, prove heavier in the end." A clock somewhere in the house chimed the quarter. The sound shivered through the room like distant artillery. Miss Pym lifted her gaze to Whimsy's. "Must I be arrested?" "That, happily, is not my province," he said. "The law is concerned with principles. Accessories after the fact, especially those misled, often fare more mercifully." He turned to Bunter. "Fetch Inspector Cowper upon his return. He must hear Miss Pym's statement in full." Bunter nodded and departed, leaving Whimsy and the lady alone among the spectral patterns of leaded glass light. "Lord Peter," Miss Pym said, voice low, "do you believe in redemption?" He considered. "Redemption, certainly, but it seldom arrives hand in hand with self-forgiveness. One must slog to meet it." She bowed her head, and he let the silence rest until Bunter's footsteps returned with Cowper in tow. The inspector listened grimly as Miss Pym recounted her role, her voice steady now, as if the telling itself were penance. Cowper's jaw tightened, but when Whimsy gently indicated the embroidery hoop, the scarlet thread coiled like a confession. He lengthened his sigh and produced a notebook. "I'll place it before the magistrates," he said, "and let them sort a mercy from malice." Miss Pym nodded once. "Thank you." Cowper left to summon the constable. Whimsy lingered. "There is a final matter," he said. "Helena's letter, did you hide it?" Miss Pym's lips parted. "Yes. She wrote me first, begging sanctuary. I delayed, fearing scandal. After her death, Paul demanded her papers. I concealed that one, so he should not know she meant to leave them both. And thus his grief fermented into hatred." Whimsy exhaled. "A tragedy, Miss Pym, in the purest classical sense. Everyone plays their part, none quite meaning the outcome." She managed a faint, brittle smile, then let the chorus fall silent at last. When Whimsy emerged into the corridor, Bunter waited with hat and overcoat. "Car's ready, my lord." "Excellent. I fancy a drive before luncheon, to the cliffs, perhaps. There's a breath one can draw only, at the edge of things." As they stepped outside, the mist had thinned. Beyond the orchard, the sea lay hammered silver under a pale sun. Whimsy paused, gloved hands in pockets, and regarded the farmhouse, a weather-beaten witness to passions roiling beneath its thatch. "Bunter," he said, "never underestimate the provincial soul. It composes tragedies the Greeks might have envied. Only the chorus now wears gum boots." "Indeed, my lord." They walked to the waiting Daimler. Overhead, a flight of rooks wheeled, their cries brief, exclamatory, and then gone. Candlewick Farm would settle again into cider seasons and hens, but the echo of stage voice and scripture would linger in its beams for years to come. Yet one act remained, Whimsy reflected, sliding into the motor, to speak with Paul Lavington in his cell before the magistrate's bench convened. The man deserved to know which silences were his own and which belonged, after all, to another. The engine coughed to life, Bunter settled behind the wheel, and they drove out past the orchard, leaving Candlewick to its slow knitting of wounds. Ahead, the road wound between hedges jeweled with rain, toward Witheridge and whatever epilogue conscience might demand. So the day lengthened, and logic, always patient, always inexorable, drew its net a last deliberate inch tighter, preparing the stage for the unmasking of motives yet unnamed. The road between Candlewick and Witheridge unspooled like a damp ribbon, hedgerows glistening with dew and the last tatters of mist lifting as though drawn upward by invisible threads. Whimsy sat in the rear of the Daimler in reflective silence, the rhythmic pulse of tires on wet gravel punctuating his thoughts. He watched a lone rook wheel above the fields, then vanish behind a copse of alder. Somewhere in the middle distance, a train whistle sounded, thin, melancholy, definitive. Witheridge Jail was a square Victorian excrescence, all red brick and officious ironwork, its front garden displaying a single mournful lilac in an overgrown bed. A constable escorted Whimsy through corridors smelling of polished linoleum and institutional tea until they reached a narrow visiting room divided by a waist-high wood rail. Paul Lavington sat on the far bench, hands clasped, shadows pooled beneath cheekbones that seemed more prominent than the day before. He raised his eyes as Whimsy approached, something between defiance and weary curiosity flickering there. "You've come to finish the play, Lord Peter?" Lavington asked, voice low but steady. "I've come," Whimsy answered, removing his gloves with precise care, "to mend one final torn page. Even tragedies deserve proper binding." Lavington gave a brittle laugh. "Binding, yes. And what of the epilogue? Does it show me swinging in a neat quarto?" "That depends," Whimsy said, slipping the gloves into his pocket. "Not all bindings are hemp. Some are remorse, some are truth, and truth, Mr. Lavington, still wants its missing lines." He drew from his breast pocket a small envelope. "For instance, did you know Miss Pym brewed the Mulldale herself?" The printer's shoulders stiffened. "She said she would prepare something comforting. I assumed it was her hospitality." "It was," Whimsy agreed gently. "But you gave her the laudanum, did you not? A measured dose, enough to calm but not to kill. She believed you." He placed the envelope on the rail. "The chloral, however, was yours alone." Lavington's gaze flickered. "Yes, I never told her." Whimsy nodded. "She confessed, and so must you in Hall. There can be no salvation in partials. You provided the laudanum, you tampered with the clock, and you slit William's throat after the drug took hold, arranging the Bible. Yet Miss Pym, thinking to shield you, moved that same Bible from its rightful shelf and fetched the cassock cord you inked." "She only meant to protect Helena's memory," Lavington whispered. "I dragged her into it." "Precisely," Whimsy said quietly, "and she has been punishing herself ever since. Tell me, why employ the cord at all? The chloral would have done." He watched Lavington wrestle the answer out of some raw interior. "Because Mallet had a horror of strangulation," he said at last. "Helena wrote me, years ago, of his nightmares. He dreamt of being choked by red ropes. I wanted him to die inside the dream first. Even as you quoted Isaiah, Whimsy murmured. Sword imagery, blood, a cord. For a mind steeped in guilt, these are powerful props. Lavington bowed his head. I thought to give him judgment in the only language he'd understand. And in so doing, Whimsy replied, you turned scripture into a cudgel and Miss Pym's loyalty into complicity. One sin has begotten several. Silence fell, broken only by the hollow thud of a door closing somewhere down the passage. Lavington looked up, eyes glistening. Will they charge her? Likely as accessory, Whimsy said, but the magistrate may weigh intention. She lacked malice. Her greatest error was silence. He leaned on the rail. Now, Mr. Lavington, I must ask about Helena. Did she truly intend to return to you? A faint color crept into the man's cheeks. She wrote she would leave William and go to London. I dared to hope she'd send for me. He swallowed. The last letter I received spoke only of fear. She never mentioned escape again. I blamed him. Now I suppose I must blame myself as well, my hesitation to act, my cowardice. Whimsy slid the envelope across. Inside is Helena's final letter, concealed by Miss Pym till yesterday. Read it. He waited while Lavington opened the flap with trembling fingers, unfolded the paper, and scanned the faded ink. As he reached the end, something clamped in his throat. Tears blurred the careful lines. She was going to Italy, he whispered. A nursing post. She asked Agatha to forward mail. She wanted a clean start, without either of us. Freedom, Whimsy said softly. Neither husband nor cousin, only herself. Your tragedy, Mr. Lavington, is that you killed a man for a woman who had already chosen life elsewhere. Lavington pressed the letter to his forehead. Despair lanced through him like wire. What do I do with this knowledge? He asked, voice cracking. Begin by speaking the whole truth in court, Whimsy replied. Spare Miss Pym where truth permits, and if you can, forgive yourself. He tapped the letter. Perhaps confess your love rather than your rage. Helena deserves that. A guard called time. Lavington folded the letter, eyes raw but resolute, and placed it against his heart. I will. He hesitated. Lord Peter, tell Agatha I'm sorry. Tell her the Bible verse should have been from Corinthians, not Isaiah. Love keeps no record of wrongs, Whimsy supplied. Lavington managed a ghost of a smile. Something like that. Whimsy inclined his head, then departed, boots echoing along the corridor. Outside, Bunter waited beside the car, spring sunlight now full upon the cobbles. All settled, my lord? He asked. As settled as such matters can be, Whimsy said. He glanced skyward. Let us return. There are arrangements to suggest to Inspector Cowper and Miss Pym's solicitor. The journey back felt swifter, for the clouds had thinned and the hedgerows stood bright with celandine. Whimsy, mood somnolent, tapped a finger on his knee in silent syncopation. Bunter, he said suddenly, do you remember the case of the Dorking Threnode? Vividly, my lord. The clergyman's wife and the forged madrigals. Precisely. Similar in that art became weapon. Yet there we averted disaster. Here we arrived, but post-scriptum. Still an outcome, Bunter said gently. A necessary reckoning. Whimsy smiled thinly. Pray heaven it is also a useful caution. They reached Candlewick by early afternoon. Cowper stood on the gravel sweep, his face wearing the resigned fatigue of a man whose paperwork has doubled by breakfast. Whimsy relayed the interview. Cowper took notes with methodical displeasure, nodded once, and went indoors to telephone the Crown Prosecutor. Whimsy, meanwhile, strolled to the orchard. Beneath one gnarled bramley, Miss Pym knelt, secateurs at her side, gathering early windfalls into a basket. She rose as he approached, straightened her back, and met his eyes steadily. He understands. Whimsy said simply. She clasped her hands, relief and grief warring on her face. Will it lessen his sentence? Perhaps. The law may yet be severe, but it need not be merciless. She closed her eyes a moment, lips moving in what might have been prayer. When she looked up again, she seemed older and, in an odd way, lighter. Will you stay to tea, Lord Peter? In a while. There is one more thread to snip. He nodded toward the granary. The inspector will shortly remove the police seal. When he does, that room must be cleansed, the stove dismantled, the floor relaid. Death leaves stains that bleach will not shift, but labor can. I shall see to it, she said. He touched the brim of his hat and walked back toward the house where Bunter, ever discreet, already laid out traveling rugs to air. The breeze carried the faint perfume of apple blossom mingled with wood smoke from some distant hearth. Life, relentless in its quiet industry, pushed on. Inside, Whimsy penned 2 notes, one to Dr. Wycombe requesting a concise report for the magistrate, the other to his sister, Lady Mary, promising to spend Easter at Duke's Denver with nothing more sinister than boiled eggs. Sealing them, he allowed himself one last glance around the parlor, at the restored steadiness of the grandfather clock, at the shelf where Fox's martyrs stood shoulder to shoulder with Donne, at the vacant space the Bible had left. When all was ready, he found Miss Pym again. She led him to the kitchen where Mrs. Tarleton, cheeks still pinched but determinedly practical, set plain scones and a pot of smoky lapsang on the scrubbed table. They ate with solemn courtesy. Conversation flagged, resumed, found its footing on safer topics, the vagaries of orchard pests, the pending Haymarket prices, the likely blue egg yield of Miss Pym's Araucanas. At length, Whimsy rose, dabbed his lips, and extended his hand. Miss Pym clasped it, her grip firm. You said redemption requires slog, she reminded him, and honesty, he added. Begin there, and the rest follows at its own pace. She nodded. I shall. Bunter collected hat and coat. Whimsy slipped into the tweed like a man shrugging on a gentler weather. They stepped onto the doorstep, the late sun slanting bronze through the orchard rose. Goodbye, Lord Peter, Miss Pym said. He tipped his hat. Au revoir, Miss Pym. May your apples ripen sweeter for the storm. With that, he descended the steps. The Daimler growled, gravel spat, and soon only dust motes whirled in their wake while Candlewick stood quiet once more, ready, perhaps, to weave its next season of cider and contrition beneath the murmurous wings of rooks. Yet for Whimsy, as the miles folded behind him and the landscape widened toward London's grey magnetism, a single line from Donne echoed in rhythm with the engine. Any man's death diminishes me. He had always known it, but Candlewick had written it anew upon his mind, in red silk and printer's ink, an indelible reminder that no mind of logic, however fine, can wholly tidy the litter of the human heart. The Daimler rolled into London under a soft dusk that turned the Thames to tarnished pewter and set the lamps along the embankment glowing like faintly ironic halos. Whimsy dismissed the car. At Duke's Gate, sent Bunter onto Park Lane with the luggage, and walked the remaining streets on foot, needing the common hum of traffic and the smell of wet stone to rinse Candlewick's residue from his thoughts. In Piccadilly, he ducked into his club for a solitary sherry, found the tape-striped leather absurdly comforting, and endured 3 minutes of small talk about a forthcoming test match before slipping away to Bell Yard. There, in a room that smelled faintly of India rubber, he discovered Charles Parker bent over a stack of witness statements like a heron stalking minnows. Ah, Parker said, looking up. Back from the cider fens, I see. I heard you'd bagged a murderer with a Bible and a printing press. Trust you to mix divinity with typography. Whimsy sank into the opposite chair. My dear man, one must diversify. Besides, it wasn't the Bible that killed him. It merely provided stage directions. Parker grunted. Cowper wired. Lavington's given a full statement, corroborated by Miss Pym. Prosecutor thinks manslaughter more likely than murder. It seems the chloral dose might, under other circumstances, have been survivable. Not when combined with a slit throat, Whimsy observed. Quite. Parker shuffled papers. Any loose ends? One, Whimsy said, but not of the hanging variety. And he told Parker of Helena's concealed letter, of Miss Pym's stitched-in silence, and of Lavington's last request for Corinthians. Parker listened, tapping a pencil against his teeth. Well, he said finally, that is a tragedy, but at least he has the truth now. Good work, Peter. Work? Whimsy echoed. It feels curiously like having pulled a weed and found a burial mound beneath. He glanced at the clock. Speaking of burials, I promised my sister Easter at Denver. The Dowager will claim I avoid the country because it smells of grass. You do, Parker said, and you'll go anyway, to cleanse your palate. Whimsy stood. A man must attempt redemption where he may. Outside, the sky had deepened to a bruised violet. He walked home to 110A Piccadilly, where Bunter had already unpacked the bags, laid out slippers, and produced a modest supper of scrambled eggs with anchovy paste. Whimsy ate mechanically, then retreated to the study and pulled from the shelf a compact volume of Donne. He read the sermon on the bell again, tracing with his finger the line that had shadowed Candlewick. No man is an island. Then he wrote a short note to Miss Pym. No moralizing, only the promise of a London bookseller who specialized in obscure horticultural tracts, should she require distraction among the pelargoniums, and sealed it with wax the color of claret. He might have gone to bed then, but his restlessness tugged him out once more. He caught a late cab to Russell Square and mounted the familiar stairs to Harriet's flat. Light still glowed at the transom. When she opened the door, fountain pen in hand, eyebrows raised over questioning eyes, he merely said, "May I borrow a mind unclouded by printer's ink?" She swept him inside, placed him in a chair, and poured coffee black as judgment. He recounted the case with the brevity born of fatigue, omitting no cruelties, yet softening their edges with wry turns. Harriet listened, chin in palm, and when he finished, she reached across to squeeze his wrist. "You can't save them all," she said. "I know." He turned the coffee cup. "But I minded this one more than usual, perhaps because there was too much theater in it. I dislike killers who step onto a stage and expect the audience to applaud the corpse." "Then write your own curtain speech," she said. "Turn the lights up, let the house see the ropes and pulleys." He smiled. "You always make ethics sound like set design." "Same craft," she said, "just fewer critics." He left her flat an hour later, lighter for the laughter they had traded, and allowed the cab to carry him back through streets almost deserted now. Big Ben told too as he let himself into Piccadilly. In the hall mirror he caught sight of his face, drawn, faintly grey, and thought, not without irony, that Mallet's red silk thread had stitched new lines around his eyes. Holy Saturday found him on the 10:30 train to Duke's Denver, Bunter opposite with a hamper of sandwiches and a sheaf of unopened Times. Whimsy tried to read. The landscape slid by in green-brown blurs. Eventually he surrendered to reverie. He saw Candlewick again, the granary's lamp throwing jaundiced squares on wet sacks. Miss Pym's scarlet floss coiling like arterial blood. Lavington's eyes when truth struck him harder than any rope. And behind it all, Helena's half-imagined smile from some Italian convent window, free at last of every script except the one she wrote for herself. He woke from the drift as the train braked into Denver. The Dowager Duchess awaited them at the station with her Victorian wicker picnic basket and a conviction that the world's ills were best soothed by Dundee cake. They drove to the house beneath budding limes. Whimsy submitted to her affectionate scolding, promising to eat, sleep, and by all means refrain from poking dead bodies for a fortnight. Easter morning dawned bright. the sort of keen, luminous day that makes even stone churches seem carved of air. Whimsy attended service, sang the familiar hymns, and caught himself, during the creed, wondering whether Mallet's last conscious moment had contained any shred of belief. It was an uncomfortable question. He let it pass with the rising alleluias. After lunch, he walked with Gerald among the paddocks, discussing estate accounts and the maddening obstinacy of sheep. At the stile, Gerald, worn but shrewd, glanced sideways. "Another job cleared, I hear." "Yes," Whimsy said. "Sordid but tidy." Gerald nodded. "You look tired." "Rather." Whimsy leaned on the gate. "Tell me, Jerry, do we ever do enough to stave off the world's stupidities?" "Good Lord, no," Gerald said. "But we keep at it, because if we don't, the stupidities pile higher." Whimsy laughed. "Spoken like a true landlord." "Spoken like a man with fences to mend," Gerald retorted. Then, more quietly, "Keep mending yours, Peter. We need you." Whimsy touched the brim of his hat in mock salute and turned down the lane. The breeze carried up the faint scent of hyacinth from the walled garden, clean and promising. That evening, after the family dispersed to card tables and the dowager's peculiar parlor charades, he sat alone in the library and penned a final letter to Paul Lavington. He chose thick cream paper, wrote with a deliberate, even hand. "My dear Mr. Lavington, the magistrate has accepted the solicitor's petition. You will face the lesser charge of manslaughter. I make no comment on justice. She is as blind as Horace, and sometimes as tuneless. But I enclose a stanza from Donne that you may not know. God himself is the author of all poetry, and he is the god of tears as well as smiles. I hope, in time, you will read both kinds without bitterness. Yours sincerely, Peter Whimsy." He sealed it, addressed it, and set it beside tomorrow's post. Then, striking a match, he lit the fire, propped his feet on the fender, and allowed himself at last the luxury of emptiness. Flames chased one another up oak logs. Outside, an owl called, patient and solitary. Whimsy closed his eyes. "It is finished," he whispered. To no one, to everyone, and let the crackle of burning wood carry the words upward, mingling with smoke until they became indistinguishable from the hush of an ordinary English night. The gathering at Candlewick Farm was subdued in the late afternoon light, as if the house itself, having exhaled after its harrowing secret, was settling into a reluctant peace. Whimsy stood by the window, watching the shadows lengthen across the wet garden paths. The time had come to draw the veil back one last time. His audience was small but attentive. Gerald, still looking quietly beleaguered by farm affairs. Miss Pym, poised yet pale, her hands folded demurely. And Lavington, seated stiffly, a man newly shorn of illusions. Even the Dowager Duchess had been inveigled to attend, her customary haughty reserve softened by curiosity. Whimsy began without preamble. The puzzle, as you know, presented itself as a tangled skein of threads, a secret letter, a forged alibi, and a seemingly accidental death that bore all the hallmarks of design. We have examined clocks, timetables, and the very architecture of Candlewick itself. And as always, the simplest explanation, when properly understood, is the truth. He paused, allowing his words to settle like dust on the gathered faces. The key, I said earlier, was the letter found among the lace handkerchiefs. Not merely a note, but a confession carefully crafted to mislead. Its wording suggested a suicide, its timing a misdirection, yet it was the letter's absence in the solicitor's files that first aroused suspicion, a gap where one might expect completeness. This was not oversight, but intent. Turning to Lavington, Whimsy's gaze sharpened. "Mr. Lavington, you said that on the night of the incident you were with Miss Pym at the granary. Both of you testified to this independently, yet the clock in the granary Was it not stopped at precisely 9:07 p.m., the very minute the bell ceased to toll? A clock stopped, of course, does not measure time. It conceals it. Lavington's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The testimony that you were together is contradicted by the fact that only one footprint was found outside the granary door, Miss Pym's. Yours, sir, were absent, save for the faint impression near the back gate, indicating you were elsewhere, near the east wing, where the servants' quarters stand. True enough, Lavington murmured, shifting uneasily. Moreover, Whimsy continued, the missing salver, which Mr. Mallett's wife claimed vanished that evening, was found this morning tucked behind the kitchen dresser, a detail so trivial it seemed unworthy of note. Yet it was the repository of a single damning clue, a faint smear of blood, no larger than a pinhead. He held up a small envelope. The salver was removed and replaced not by accident, but as a staging device. Your intention, Mr. Lavington, was to fabricate a scenario in which the victim's death might appear self-inflicted, or at worst, a tragic accident. But a man who combines chloral hydrate with a throat wound is not careless, but deliberate. Miss Pym's eyes glistened, a mixture of relief and sorrow. Whimsy's voice took on its usual arch cadence. You endeavored to engineer an alibi supported by your mistress, who, I regret to say, was complicit, though reluctant. The secret correspondence, hidden beneath false names and ecclesiastical quotations, was your weapon, but it was flawed, most notably by your neglect to consider the precise duration of the bell tolls, a detail Miss Pym was too discreet to notice, but which we reconstructed in full. He smiled faintly. And so, the chronology collapsed, and your tale unraveled. You attempted a stage trick worthy of the old Vic, but forgot that real lives do not take their cues from playwrights. Mr. Lavington, you stand convicted not merely by evidence, but by your own miscalculation of human nature. The man's shoulders slumped. It was never meant to come to this, he said bitterly. She was going to leave me. I couldn't bear the disgrace. Whimsy nodded. Desperation is a poor dramaturge, and jealousy an unreliable script. Yet I cannot say I blame you entirely. It is human to err in love and anger, though fatal when intertwined. The room was silent, save for the ticking of a clock, steady, truthful, and unyielding. Whimsy turned to Gerald. I trust you will see that justice here is tempered by mercy. There is no villainy without motive, nor innocence without fault. As the others departed, Whimsy lingered a moment in the library, savoring the quiet. He reached for Donne once more, his fingers tracing the familiar words. No man is an island, entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent. He closed the book gently. Some mysteries left more questions than answers, but the theater of human frailty was, perhaps, the greatest drama of all. Lighting his pipe, he stepped out into the cool evening. The first stars blinked into existence, silent witnesses to truths spoken and secrets laid bare.